Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture, where we will be talking about World War II and its impact across different racial and ethnic groups. So one of the groups that was significantly impacted during this time period were Japanese Americans. On February 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which ordered Japanese Americans to be detained and sent to internment camps. What we saw in the reading is that there were some disagreements about whether this was necessary. While FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover did not believe that mass internment of Japanese could be justified for security reasons, Lieutenant General DeWitt, head of the Western Defense Command, disagreed and believed that Japanese Americans would never be loyal Americans. So many Japanese Americans, they lost their homes, they lost their businesses in order to be taken to these internment camps. They were basically given like a week to pack everything, sell everything, and report themselves to be transported to wherever they were going to stay for the duration of the war. But at the same time, many Japanese American men served as soldiers in World War II. Serving in the war was a way to demonstrate their loyalty to the United States and prove that they were Americans. However, after returning from the war, many Japanese American soldiers faced discrimination in the US, as we saw with the story of Captain Inouye, who shared that when trying to get a haircut, wearing his army jacket covered with ribbons and medals for his military heroism, he was told, "We don't serve Japs here." One of the things that you may not know is that one of these internment camps was here in Colorado, near the town of Grenada. It's known as Camp Omachi, and and at its peak, it housed 7,300 Japanese internees. 2/3 of them were American citizens. African Americans, as we saw, served in the military during the war, 900,000 of them. However, they served in segregated military units. The rhetoric around the war for freedom, this was what World War II was described as in the US, became a way for African Americans, excuse me, in the US to criticize segregation and the discrimination that they encountered. One of the sentiments expressed by an African-American was this quote, "Here lies a Black man killed fighting a yellow man for the protection of the white man." And so there was a sense that this was a war created and organized by white men that pinned men of color to fight against each other. Many African Americans protested about the segregation in the military. After protests, Black men were allowed to serve as Air Force pilots in the segregated unit at the Tuskegee Air Force Base. Finally, Executive Order 8802 desegregated defense industry jobs. Defense industry jobs were significant during this time period because of the demand for labor. It allowed for women and other people of color who didn't serve during the war to participate in the war effort by working in the defense industry. For Chinese Americans, we see the war being an opportunity for them to be perceived in a favorable light in the United States. Japanese propaganda calling out the United States for its exclusion of Chinese immigrants resulted in Congress having to reconsider its exclusionary policies and repealing the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Because China was an ally during this war against Japan, it behooved the United States to treat Chinese Americans better in order to make sure that China continued to be an ally. You saw patriotic fervor among Chinatowns to serve in the war. They could leave restaurants and laundry work for defense industry jobs, including women. And as I mentioned, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943. For Mexican Americans, we see a similar kind of experience. 500,000 men enlisted in the armed forces during the war. Again, this was a way to demonstrate their loyalty and their Americanism. The Bracero program was initiated to recruit agricultural workers from Mexico at this time, again, because of the high demand of labor and the decrease in labor available in the US because of so many men were serving in the war. This created a scarcity in laborers in the United States. And so this is why now they're tapping into bringing agricultural workers from Mexico. All of a sudden, it's okay for women to work outside of the home because they needed people basically to work. And so many Mexican American women entered the defense industry at this time as well. And this experience taught them to work with other racial ethnic groups as well. And we saw in the reading that often they ended up working with African American women because some of the white women refused to work with the Black women. For Native Americans, we see sort of this division where some questioned why they should fight for a white man's war. Yet at the same time, we see, because of the conditions in some of their communities of poverty and so on, joining the military at this time became one of the few alternatives that they have. So 20% of Native Americans serving in the war were Navajos. As I mentioned, poverty conditions encouraged Navajos to enlist. And the reading talked about the Navajo code talkers and how they were instrumental during the war for their language. They were used as code talkers because their language was one code the enemy wasn't able to decipher. Navajo soldiers, however, paid a high cost or high price for their participation in the war. Many returned with psychological effects of the war, and this then continued to have an impact in their communities. For Jewish Americans, we see the particular experience and again, being split in terms of their thoughts about the war and how they should participate or support Jewish refugees. At first, Jewish American organizations, in their effort to demonstrate that they were Americans first, and in order to avoid anti-Semitic sentiments in the US, opposed legislation proposed that would have allowed German Jews to flee to the United States. Another heart-wrenching story that was shared in the text was the story of the Jewish refugees aboard the ship St. Louis, circling between Florida and Cuba, hoping that Cuba or the US would take them. Eventually, they were sent back to Europe. The War Refugee Board was to create plans for rescuing Jewish refugees from Europe and find places of settlement for them, but this did not happen until 1942, after confirmation that the stories of Jewish genocide were actually real. At the end of the war, it led to the US supporting the partition of Palestine and creating a Jewish state in Israel. And in one of the clips, video clips that I have listed for you to watch this week, you see sort of the heart-wrenching experience and reactions of Jewish American soldiers who were serving in the war when they start liberating some of the camps in Europe, and how horrible it was for them to see their own people and how they had been treated during the war. Finally, the reading talked about the atomic bomb and the bombing basically of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, and the events that led to that. So Winston Churchill called for allowing Japan to surrender with the condition they be allowed to keep the emperor system. This was one of the things that, even though Japan by this point in the war was ready to surrender, they weren't willing to give up their emperor system. And so this was what was keeping them basically from continuing to fight in the war. Truman, however, who was the president at the time of the US by this point in the war, insisted on unconditional surrender of Japan. Japan had been asking the Russians to help negotiate a surrender. So Japan was ready to surrender, but again, the president here was insistent that they needed to give up their emperor system. So in order to try to persuade Japan to surrender unconditionally, Truman orders the atomic bomb be dropped on Hiroshima, where 75,000 people die, including women and children. 3 days later, a second bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. However, even after the 2 bomb assaults on Japan, the Japanese would still only surrender as long as they could keep their emperor system, to which the US finally accepted. So in other words, the US dropped these bombs, caused significant horrific damage and casualties, and still didn't get the unconditional surrender from Japan. So this ends the lecture for this week. I look forward to your comments in our discussion post. Have a great week.